I think most of you know who I am, and I'm going to talk for 2 evenings. Unlike the previous lecture a few days ago, which was talking about other people's work and the whole drawing thing slightly with reference to the exhibition, I'm actually going to talk about my own work. And as you know from the leaflet, it is divided into 2 parts. That until the middle of 1975, and that from about the middle of 1975. Not being a terribly good historian, even with my own material, there's the odd thing that strays in and out of the category. But broadly speaking, this will have to do. There was simply too much stuff to try and cram it into one evening. What I've also tried to do is to not only cover the material that is on the wall, but also to include a few things that I suppressed from the exhibition, or couldn't find, or didn't like enough, or for some other reason we didn't have time or energy to find the proper drawing, so that I will probably dwell on certain things that are not on the wall rather more than the things that are on the wall. Tough. Could I have the lights out, please, and the first 2 slides? The family mythology about why I bothered to do architecture, my parents are now both dead, but at the time was assumed to be the fact that as a child, I was born in 1936, and so as a very, very tiny kiddie in England during the wartime, I was taken by my father. I played hooky from school to go with him in the car to look at buildings. Now, the explanation of this is that my father was an army colonel who was responsible for putting troops into Italianate villas in the English Midlands. And this tiresome child was taken to see these Italianate villas. And I didn't know what they were about. I didn't even know they were Italianate. I just thought they were bloody great houses which I could take my model boat and sail in the pond of, or the lake of, or whatever. And it didn't make much difference to me whether there were sort of 6 airborne divisions or 3 squadrons of tanks, or no tanks. And my father was a professional soldier whose knowledge of architecture simply went to the extent of saying, I think we can get 6 platoons in there and 53 tents there, which is a very rough and ready way of getting the sniff of ready-made architecture. But somehow or other, as I say, the family mythology went that my interest in buildings sprung somewhere from this point. Suffice it to say that at the nubile age of 16, I left school after O-levels, which was at that time still just possible, and went to the local architecture school in I like the idea of children being at lectures, but it is actually rather off-putting. Yes, I left school at 16, and I went to the local architecture school, which was attached to an art school, and joined this class, which was the last surviving place where, in England, you were made to draw the 5 orders of architecture in pencil. You were made to draw ionic columns in axonometric. You were made to lay washes and washes. It was, in fact, the English provincial leftover of the École de Beaux-Arts system. It was a very curious place indeed, in a church hall that was dominated by 2 ping-pong tables and plaster casts and people drawing these ionic columns and so on. So it was, in a sense, in a very, very tacky way, the old architectural room of the old art academy. And like all such people, one heard about the AA as a sort of magic place, and I have to admit, I can still remember this, that as a spotty provincial, it became very rapidly my ambition not to be an architect, but to come to the A. Almost like coming to the A was the thing to do. I didn't quite see what would happen after that. It meant that one would be some sort of architect, but to actually come to London, to this funny place where people were doing a special architecture, which I'd heard about and read about, was an objective. The other funny thing I can remember from about second year was reading in the Architectural Review the potted biographies of 30 interesting, I think it was called something like 30 interesting young architects. And it would appear that 25 of the 30 had been to the A, that 29 of the 30 taught at various architecture schools, and that 30 of the 30 did competitions. And to my sort of tiny mind at the time, it seemed that is what you did. You went to the A, you then became a teacher, and you did competitions, and the rest would emerge, and you would become one of the 30 you too would become one of the 30 interesting English architects. I tell you this sort of background because I think that, and I haven't got slides to prove it. These two slides are, however, from the period when I did come to the A. The scheme on the left was done during fourth year and was actually part of a working drawing program done under the teaching of I think, and if you talk to people like Cedric, who was a near contemporary, and Richard Rogers and people like that, I think you'll find we will all agree that although perhaps names with whom we are now more familiar were teaching at the time. I'm terribly sorry, I can't lecture with that noise going on. I know that sounds uptight, but I find it very off-putting. There are people who were at the A at that time who are considered to be more interesting architects, but as far as teaching is concerned, John Killick was, in fact, far and away the most exciting teacher and was responsible, I think, for tremendous upsurge in work and a very wide and Catholic variety of work. I mean, in our particular year, there were people like the Christian Weirdies, who latterly became people like Quinlan Terry and Andrew Anderson. There was John Outram, who at that time was doing fiberglass, molded fiberglass tank houses. A whole lot of people who had come across from what is now the Central Poly, who had done a magazine called Polygon, upon which really the early origins of archigram have to be seen in historical context. There's quite an absolutely polyglot group of people. And it was because Killick was extremely tolerant of many different styles of architecture that the Gothicists and the molded fiberglass people and the sort of expressionists and the cool school and a whole lot of different people were tolerated within the same year at the same time. It was not a unit system. So my boiler house on the left was, I think, pretty mainstream. It was after all, one was being taught by the people who had done the Alton West housing at Roehampton. The boiler house program was exactly that of the boiler house for the Alton West estate. We were given all the requirements for the heating system and simply told to put a carcass around it. And it was in fourth year at that time, Killick instituted a program which had 9 projects. There were 9 projects in fourth year, 4 in the first term. There were 5 nervous breakdowns out of the 60 or 70 people, and one just banged through it. I say nothing about it except that it was one of the straighter of the projects that I did. And the drawing on the right was of the short program for the 5th year. The first term of the 5th year was to design a 500-bedroom hotel with banqueting arrangements for the St. George's Hospital site at Hyde Park Corner. And there again, one had to do sort of semi-working drawings at the end of that project. That gives you just some idea of the sort of discipline of the situation. And one was a child of that period. I seem to remember also, next 2 slides, that, oh sorry, it's me doing it, isn't it? That one oscillated between different sort of modes, even during the short period that I was, the 2.5 years I was at the AA. The plan on the left, and I don't have any other drawings of this, was of a group project. One of the 9 projects that we did in 4th year, I think the time allowed for this housing scheme was 5 weeks. And it had to be done more or less to the GLC standards, or the LCC standards as they then were, bearing in mind that our teachers had all worked on housing schemes for the LCC, and we were provided with 30-page dossiers as to exactly how to do the fire escape systems and all the rules of public housing for London. When I left the AA, I immediately went to work for a firm called James Cubitt and Partners, which a lot of people have passed through subsequently at this place. And my intention was to get to do competitions as quickly as I possibly could. And there was a competition announced, I think, in about November after the school year for Piccadilly Circus. It was an ideas competition. And the scheme on the right, which I did with somebody called Gordon Sainsbury, was my project for it. And you can see the sort of, I mean, it's like really like looking at somebody else's work. You can see all the influences that there were. It was a little bit of Saint-Hilaire, a little bit of Louis Kahn, a little bit of, you know, how high you can go in concrete, and a ridiculous spaghetti system of roads. It was one of those sort of road systems that really ought to be on the outskirts of Atlanta and is actually piled into to surround the Eros statue. And a large, cumbersome model. And another thing that I'll notice about myself is a tendency for schemes which have started off in some more rational or more rectilinear form to tend to end up as circular. I'll say no more about that. But it's a funny thing I've noticed, that I always seem to get happy when the thing starts to be circular, but it very rarely starts off as circular. Neither of those 2 schemes, I still have a good memory, neither of those 2 schemes started off as circular, nor did the Blue House, nor did the Trondheim Library, etc., etc., etc. But isn't it funny how they sort of start to circularize? We did, after the Piccadilly Circus competition, I did, I think, about 3 competitions in quick succession. David Green and I did the Liverpool, I'm getting confused, the Lincoln Civic Centre competition, which Eldred Evans won. And we did the Reading County Offices competition. This is all within the first year out of school. And then the next competition that I did, I actually won, which is a thing called the Gas House competition, which was for old people's housing that in some way would use gas. Never got built, but it was useful to suddenly come into some money, and Hazel and I suddenly sprouted leather coats and started taking taxes, which is what I remember about the situation. A little before that, we had a group of people who would meet. Sounds terribly pretentious now, and I think there was a whiff of this about 2 or 3 years ago, when the Lonely Arts Club used to meet somewhere in London. And we had these rather pretentious meetings of a group of people who used to meet, who knew each other via a greasy spoon cafe in Swiss Cottage, and came not only from the A but the Poly, and from Nottingham, and from the Bartlett. It was a sort of strange group of people. And we knew each other, and we started to meet, and we decided that we had this heroic sort of objective, which was to do competitions and to write to the newspapers. I mean, quite what competitions we were to do and quite what we were to write to the newspaper, I can't remember, but that was our set of objectives. And as a byproduct of that, we thought that at some moment we would produce some kind of pamphlet. And what happened was, as soon as we did actually start doing the competitions, this once a week meeting in each other's flat group broke down. I mean, it met probably 7 or 8 times. And then as soon as we'd formed the little teams that were simultaneously doing the same competitions, we were suddenly rivals. We didn't want to meet again. And what remained of that was this broadsheet, which basically David and I did using the Office Roneo for the poetic sheet, which is mostly David Green's work, and the shop across the road that in the basement printed offset litho, which happened to be underneath Cedric Price's office, which is how we met Cedric Price, which was meeting him in the printers and sort of knowing him as somebody who'd been around the A. The idea of the archigram was that it was like a telegram or an aerogram. It wasn't a magazine, it was just a thing that came as a folded piece of paper. And the other idea about it was that it would upset people. This was always a very early objective, that we would do things that would get up their nose. Now, who they were and quite what nose it was, it's a little bit unspecified, except that you sort of did know. And it was very cheaply printed, and it sold for 9p. And nobody bought it. And somebody many of you may remember, called Crispin Osborne, who was also working in the same office as a year-out student. Somehow or other, David and I conned him into being the person who would cycle up and down Gloucester Place, trying to sell this 9p thing in offices. And poor old Crispin would sort of go up and down the brass-plated W1 offices and come back saying, "I've sold 3, you know, and that was considered an amazing triumph." And the other thing we used to do is to amazing collages, which were mostly gleaned from things like Evergreen Review and sort of collages and tensegrity masks and so on, which we would nail up outside the gentleman's toilet of our office, knowing that all the Drearys had to go and have a pee, and that therefore even they, who we wanted to upset because we were irritated by them, had to look at our artwork. There was nothing they could do to stop it. It sounds as if we were really very unpleasant people, which maybe we were. We'd spend most of the time actually sort of doing competitions on a masked board. The idea was that you had the board that you drew on in the office, and we contrived to all work in the same part of the office. And you'd have these masked boards that would immediately be rolled up as soon as nobody was there, and you'd scratch a few lines on the competitions and then roll the mask down again. Needless to say, eventually, although it took about 2 years, we got slung out, or at least I got slung out, for being a disruptive influence, and then discovered that James Sterling had been slung out of the same office for having his feet up and reading the Daily Express. So I recommend anybody who wants to create a certain amount of architectural notoriety to go and work for James Cubitt and Partners. I think they still exist. And the world is then, of course, your oyster. The gas house competition was this extraordinarily dull-looking object on the left, which won because it was amazingly tightly planned, it may amuse you to know. Had all sorts of nifty devices for sort of putting your plimsolls underneath the gas heater and still having room to fold down the refrigerator, and all those sort of things that that one had learnt from sort of flatlet dwelling, I think. Anyhow, it got me 500 quid, which at that time was worth quite a lot of money. And the scheme on the right, which is probably the first thing that begins to have faintly archigrammic overtones, is actually a rework of the scheme on the left. The room arrangement, the size of the dwelling units and so on is almost exactly the same. All that happens to it is that it begins to acquire sort of pseudo-car body surfacing and a high-rise and a few tubes linking it. And I will perfectly honestly admit that the influence must have come from the work of really, I think, the hero of the whole thing, which is Mike Webb, whose work is seen on the right. That furniture factory project of Mike Webb on the right was his 4th year project, and he was an exact contemporary. And at that time, there was a tremendous rivalry between the then Regent Street Polytechnic and the AA. We would run across to see their work, and they would come across to see our work. And one year they would be slightly up, and the next year we would be slightly up. I think the break came when John Outram and some other people switched from Mike's year at the Poly over to the AA. because although they were doing very exciting work, I think the people teaching here were more interesting. But there was this very, very exciting rivalry between two schools whose work, let us say, broadly speaking, was at the same level, and an underground which existed between them. And certainly certain AA people were encouraged to show their schemes in Polygon. David Green had meanwhile come from Nottingham, which also produced Tony Gwilliam, for those of you who remember such things. And Buckminster Fuller had taught for amazingly, had taught for about a month or two at Nottingham, had influenced this whole series of people. So there was this weird underground, and one has to do a little bit of name dropping here, that as trainees, we had between us an extraordinary series of people. Mike Webb was taught by Jim Sterling and Ken Frampton. I was taught by Smithson Killick and James Gowan. David had been taught by Bucky and an extraordinary guy called Paul Ritter, who later went to Australia. And I won't name drop any further, but I think there must be some carry through there. I don't think it's just sort of accident. I think that one was aware, certainly speaking for myself, that at certain moments in time our teachers were the people who were being commented on in the press, were the people who were either winning the competitions or doing the most exciting projects for the competitions. There was this sort of, not exactly basking in reflective glory, but this feeling you did actually have a lot of time for the people who were teaching you. And at that time, certainly you couldn't say this as a generalization. I must speed up. I merely want to say then that Mike continued with, as you know, the Sin Centre project on the left, which was failed 5 times by the Polytechnic. And after the Gas House, I went on doing competitions, sometimes getting a prize, sometimes not, and ploughing bits of money back into the publication. It sort of emerged after about the 2nd issue that I seemed to be the person who did the magazine. And from this little sort of local coterie of people in London who first contributed their student projects to the magazine, we had this funny idea of writing to people who we'd vaguely heard of in and around town. And Archigram 2 was the product of people who one didn't know as cronies, but whose work one had seen in competition lists or had heard about on the sort of grapevine. In that way, and the sort of the Nottingham circuit and Cedric Price and somebody up in Yorkshire and somebody slightly interesting at the Bartlett. And I remember the way I met Ron Heron, Warren Chalk and Dennis Crompton was simply by writing them a letter, which may surprise you. I actually had heard of them. I'd seen some competitions they'd got prizes in. And I wrote, "Dear Mr. Heron, Mr. Chalk and Mr. blah, blah, blah." And then there was a sort of phone call from an unknown voice saying, "Oh, I got your letter. Yes, it sounds interesting. We'll send something to your magazine." I mention this because I think the English are very sort of shy. You know, I didn't sort of do what one might do now, which is to find out which pub they went to and sort of say, you know, "Hello, how about sticking something in the old magazine?" I actually wrote this rather childlike letter, "Dear sir, we are interested in your work." Anyhow, it doesn't matter because it worked and was a sort of, let us say, I mean, I'm very interested in the structures of elitism, which I won't dwell upon this evening, but I'm interested in the fact that if you do sit around a city, you do hear about certain people, and then you have to be a little bit cheeky or a little bit obvious and actually move your bum in some way and contact them. And I think I still think that sort of thing is tremendously important. Having been kicked out of Qubits the same afternoon, and this is an extraordinary coincidence, there have been 2 or 3 occasions in my life when I've been given the sack or lost a job or everything looked doomed, and the same day I've had a phone call which said, "How about this?" I don't know why, it seems to happen. The same afternoon I had a crackly voice that said, "I'm Theo Crosby. I've got this team setting up at Euston to redevelop Euston Station. Would you like to join it?" And it so happened, I just discovered that Ron Heron, Warren Chalk, Dennis Crompton et al. Had already, and Brian Richards had already joined this team. I was also paid double the salary at Qubit, so everything seemed to point to it being a good idea. And very soon after, I then said, you know, I've got these mates called Mike Webb and Dee Green, you know, they're all right, and they do the odd working drawing from time to time. And they joined, and there was an and Robin Middleton was there, no less. And Philip Tabor of the Barclay, an extraordinary gaggle of, and the late Alex Pike, who did all the solar work at Cambridge. This extraordinary group of people was gathered, ostensibly to rebuild a railway station. None of it, we knew fuck all about railway stations, but it was a good group of people. Very quickly, Crosby acted as a sort of father figure and said, hey, you guys ought to do a few things down at the ICA. You have a few funny ideas. And he conned some money out of the Gulbenkian Foundation. I mean, again, we're talking a long time ago when, again, £500 seemed like a ginormous sum. And I think it was 500 quid, but it seemed like the largest sum of money since the competition win. You know, it's really, you thought, wow, 500 quid, we can do a whole city for that, you know. You then discovered that the only way you could do it was by Dennis Warren and I would spend 3 evenings a week down in the basement at Euston welding. We actually did our own welding and our own rubber grommeting and our own cutting of metal pipe, because it's the only way we could do the whole thing for 500 quid. And we built this ridiculous structure, which was sort of what would have happened if sort of Buckminster Fuller had had a fit. In other words, it was vaguely triangulated, except it never joined up in the middle. So we then made a sort of art form of the fact that it wouldn't quite work. And we had things like periscopes. We conned the air conditioning manufacturer into... we said, we've got this amazing, futuristic, marvelous, fantastic exhibition, and we need your esteemed air conditioning. And this guy came along and said, yes, I think you'll need 43, number 14. Yes. And we constructed this thing, and then when he actually came to the exhibition, he had a total fit, because it wasn't being used for air conditioning at all. It was being used for giant periscopes, which by which you could look into the periscope and see out of the window into Dover Street, if you'd wanted to. Or to look into another periscope and see the sort of top of the bar, if you'd wanted to, which to us, I can't remember why, but for some reason that was deeply meaningful. I don't remember why, but we at the time thought it was very, very philosophically important, these periscopes. And it had a catalogue and a sort of slightly waspish review from Bob Maxwell. Suddenly, we were sort of in the public eye. We also did a number of projects that accompanied this exhibition called Living City, of which this is the one that Ron and Warren made, called Interchange. And around the same time produced the third archigram. I think our sales figures had been about 143 for issue 1. And simply what happened was that all the rest was sort of sitting in cardboard boxes. I think we then sold sort of 300 of number 2. And on the back of this, he says, on the back of this great success, we decided to push forward and produce number 3, which sold all of sort of 402 copies. But suddenly got reviewed by Rayner Banham. Reviewed by Rayner Banham and treated seriously by a famous and serious critic. And that was very weird. We didn't quite know how to handle that. And you can see the sort of strange things that it had. I mean, the diagram on the right was P. Cook's simplified explanation of the idea of the exhibition, for example. And then there were pieces of sort of collage where the whole conversation about throwaway architecture came in. So that things like the city, which is a sort of portmanteau project concerned with the idea of the throwaway city, came, let us say, after about 18 months of discussion of the idea, largely through the pages of the magazine. It wasn't particularly my idea. It was almost a sort of collective series of comments being made by various people, feeding things into both Archigram 2 and Archigram 3 on the subject of throwaway architecture. So it's like the magazine feeding the project, the discussion happening before the actual physicality of the idea. And then, during the time at Euston, which you must remember was paid for by Taylor Woodrow, we were employees of the Taylor Woodrow Construction Company. I still have a tie with 4 men pulling a rope on it to prove it. In fact, I ought to have worn it this evening. And also, Theo would push ideas within the office, such as sort of internal competitions. There was this ridiculous edict that came from Taylor Woodrow Canada that said, we're hoping to push the Taylor Woodrow standard concrete television tower in Canada. Would you do a scheme that incorporates the television tower? And Theo said, how about this, guys? And so we all did a funny competition. These are my, God knows where the television tower went in this scheme, but these were my early sort of wooden stick models of the project, which later became that. And somehow or other, I won this internal competition, was then given, I think, 2 months to work on the thing. And it had to somehow hang on to this ridiculous television tower, this spun concrete thing. So if you look closely, you find that the stalk in the middle, the bit that still sort of stays straight, of which there's about 5%, is the standard Taylor Woodrow concrete television tower. The rest is various pieces of Peacock sort of constructivist diarrhea that happened around it. And Dennis Crompton made the model, and we spent 2 months on it, and a lot of drawings, which now sit in the Architecture Museum in Frankfurt, were made. And then I think Taylor Woodrow had cold feet, and the thing was never dispatched to Canada and never became part of the Montreal Expo or anything. It just hung around in Euston for months and months until we quietly took it home. But it was an amazing, con, if you like. And it was an extraordinary, I mean, I have to say that really Archigram and all its surroundings got off the ground because Taylor Woodrow, unbeknown to themselves, were extraordinarily generous with their time. We were occasionally making working drawings. I mean, there are actually Mike Webb working drawings for the buffer stops at Euston, and there are sort of Dennis Crompton working drawings for sort of roof panels. There's even I myself personally will claim the curved corners of the parcels deck at Euston. The rest of the time, there's an extraordinary office which moved from a concrete site hut into a wooden site hut, by which time the office had been scaled down somewhat. Surprise, surprise. At one point, Robin Middleton was giving, I think, 2 lectures a week at Cambridge, and therefore disappearing out of the hut. I was producing 2 magazines. Theo Crosby himself was producing a 3rd magazine. Joe Tilson would come and do sort of odd artworks, and Warren Chalk would sit surrounded by Italian magazines in another room of this site hut. And occasionally somebody would come in with a hard hat, and we all sort of burst into... There was one extraordinary period when we were cutting the pop-up pages of Archigram 4 with the entire staff of the Taylor Woodrow experimental group was sitting with Stanley knives cutting these pop-ups. And a bloke would come in with sort of gumboots and a hard hat and wonder what the hell was going on. You know, everybody has to have their period of subsidized fun, and it sooner or later comes to an end. We knew that the end would sooner or later happen, and it did, and then we all shuffled into academe. Tracking back a bit, the real origins of the Plug-in City were this project on the left, which was another funny letter that came to David Green from his old teacher, Paul Ritter, who was a sort of funny urbanist who's since gone to Perth, Australia. And he said, oh, we're having this exhibition in Nottingham of ideas for future cities. Would you do a quick scheme? And David said to me, let's do this scheme together. And we concocted over the weekend this idea for sort of shops that you instead of trucks coming up to the back of them, you sort of put all the goods for the shop in some sort of plastic carrier bag and dropped it through the ceiling. It's a long time ago. Don't ask me why. Again, it seemed philosophically significant at the time that this should happen. And then we hit on the idea of a viaduct, which you can see in the drawing, upon which cranes would glide that could drop the shops in and the goods. So that was in very, very primitive terms. The early, and the date is something like about 1962, I think. That is the very early origin plug-in city. A slightly tarted up version of which appears on the right, which I think was called Euro City. All these have a horrific simplistic ring about them. And between that time and, let's say, about 1964 or 5, things moved very rapidly, partly, I think, for this amazing amount of time and resource paid for by Taylor Woodrow, and all the time to make these models and read these Italian magazines and use Stanley knives and all the rest of it. Between Archigram 2 and Archigram 5, which is on the left here, was a spreading of the personal network. What I said yesterday very briefly about Hollein was that I found a funny picture in an Austrian magazine, and I scissored it out and pasted it in, and we printed it in Archigram 4, misspelt the name. And there was this very polite letter from this bloke in Vienna saying, I am Hans Hollein, it was my scheme, and actually you've got the date wrong, but would you like to have a look at this catalogue? And same thing happened with funny people in Italy, funny people like Jona Friedman, Pichler, etc., etc. All the sort of nutcases around the northern hemisphere started writing to us and saying, we've seen your funny thing in a shop in Florence. Are you interested in our balloon city for the Mesa Desert? Or perhaps you would like... And my first contact with Dalibor Vasily was a similar sort of grubby envelope saying, Dear Mr. Cook, we are the continualist group of Prague. Perhaps you'd like to see our second prize-winning scheme for the National Theatre. And then suddenly the bloke turns up a year later in a sort of shabby raincoat, and he says, I'm the bloke, what sent you that letter? This has happened to me ever since. It happens still. It is one of the reasons why one of my sort of professional hobbies is being an entrepreneur, because in my warped mind I cannot separate the instinct for making architecture, discussing architecture, teaching architecture, using ideas with the existence of funny pieces of paper and grubby raincoats. And sometimes the grubby raincoats become famous people who we come and listen to in a formal way. And it still goes on, and I think there's no part of the world where you can afford to actually shut your potential eyes or mind. I think that even in the back end of Queensland, Australia, or in the north of Oulu, Finland, or west of Winnipeg, or whatever the hell you might find yourself, you must not presume that there might be somebody with a carrier bag who comes in and says, I've just done this scheme for the fold-out postmodern Lake Erie underwater city. And you must not presume that they are stupid or are not going to crop up for the rest of your life, because they always do. There's one particular man who we get packages from San Diego, who's an extreme example of this. Okay, plug-in city. Oh, by the way, the last scheme on the right was a Ron Heron Warren Chalk scheme, the interchange, which was souped up for a later publication. Okay, plug-in city then had to be presented as an idea, as a simplified set of parts. These are just sort of cartoons to explain what the thing is doing, and was worked out mainly in sort of squared exercise books and with cocktail sticks. In fact, the cocktail stick model, the standard recourse of the young architect, was necessary in the period between the Nottingham project and the so-called Euro project, and this, which you see on the staircase. There are plans. In fact, I don't know what's happened to this plan drawing, but it did exist for a long time, and it's a bad photograph and won't focus. I know that. And the plan is the forerunner of the axonometric. And the thing that always interests me now about the scheme is that its real instinct was as much to do with the formality, the sort of hillside formality of prefabricated objects, as it was to do with plug-in, plug-out, the throwaway building. There were lots and lots of funny bits of it, ideas about filling in cities, ideas about movement. The tubes carried the people and the goods and were the structure. Ideas about, you know, ruling the world, or at least ruling parts of West London. All sorts of, they look terribly banal now, but I mean, international links and dotted patches over Roehampton and things like that. These drawings came a little bit later, and the one on the right was probably about 9 months later than the axonometric, and actually pushed the thing further, started to find the difficulties within the scheme, but also at the same time became more gigantuan. And it moved on. But as I say, a lot of the time when one was doing it, and one was doing it, I mean, it wasn't all a great laugh at Taylor Woodrow's. I mean, one did actually have to work quite a lot. And so the drawings for this were done at home and would sit on the drawing board over a period of weeks or months. And I'd sort of, when I got home, I'd do an hour or so, and then do another hour or so a day later. I mean, it wasn't sort of done in a sitting. It would sit, and the drawing, I can remember the drawings for Plug-in City got terribly grubby because they were worked over quite a long period, sort of a couple of inches a day and then another couple of inches. Mike Webb's drawings get even grubbier because he's incredibly slow and meticulous, and he does about a square half-inch a day, working flat out, which is why they're such amazing drawings. And then, of course, Warren Chalk was responsible really for the probing of the actual part of the Plug-in City, I mean, which was the capsule itself. And this is Warren Chalk's capsule on the right, which you see is a very condensed and thought-through object. I have to admit that we were looking at certain sources. There's a particular issue of L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui which came out on experimental work, particularly featuring some French and American designers, people like, who sort of almost lost names now, like Paul Maimont, and somebody called Biro, or Biro, I don't know whether he actually drew with the instrument, but he had that name, and engineers like James Fitzgibbons, who latterly became a friend of Mike Webb. All sorts of funny people who we knew about, didn't know whether they were alive or dead, and until you got a letter from them, you couldn't really tell. And, of course, the work of people like Kurokawa. Kurokawa's early capsules had been published somewhere, and we were aware of them. We were studying them. And also things like Louis Kahn's Philadelphia project. And also the fact that amongst the group of us were different projects which were complementary to each other, so that Warren Chalk's capsules and the capsule tower were in a sense a complementary part of my Plug-in City, or at least were feeding ideas to it. And Dennis Crompton's Computer City was also simultaneously feeding ideas backwards and forwards. So there were like 3 or 4 of us working on bits of, in a sense, an unspoken total scheme. These drawings and diagrams are Dennis's, again, for talking about the sort of computer network that would make a Plug-in City possible. And it went on quite a long time. The model on the right, made of modified Lego, was probably done it was done in whatever year it was that England won the World Cup. I can remember actually listening, and I'm not a football fan, but you can't avoid England winning the World Cup. And whenever it was that year, and while that was on the radio, I remember making this model. And by this time, you can see the original triangulated structural system had become modified into a sort of rectilinear system. And the red and blue paths are actually linear induction paths for the idea of the electric car as a chair that moves. Now, the other thing, another sort of semi-fairy godmother that turned up was the Hornsey College of Art, which invited Mike Webb to go as a sort of researcher. And then he went off to America and he passed the job on to me. And I sat there so-called researching into the environmental effects of electric cars. And it simply bought one a day a week at a vast salary, sitting, speculating on urban structures with electric cars whizzing around. So in a sense, one hasn't had a sort of silver spoon, but one has from time to time had these useful pieces of time bought for you where you sit there doing ridiculous things that nobody's going to use, but moves the state of the discussion onwards. So the plug-in city, I've always been interested in this idea of the portmanteau scheme and then other things that happen within it. A portmanteau scheme, like the plug-in city, and later the instant city, and later the Arcadia city, which act as a gathering together of ideas which you may have been having, or other people may have been having, or may have been talked about in the air for a period of as long as 3 or 4 years, and sort of they come under that heading, they come into that bag, and somehow the pulling of them together decides certain things and probably eliminates a lot of things. So plug-in city sort of hovered on for probably 2 or 3 years until this late stage, for instance, when it became a cutout in one of the archograms. I think about archogram 7, as late as that. We drew a simplified of parts, like a kiddie's cutout, and you could cut it out and make your own plug-in city. The one on the left was actually made by Ben Banham, the son of Rayner Banham, who by this time had become a sort of crony. And all the later stage things. You can see that by the later stages, the original idea had begun to thin out. The other thing that was happening was that the magazine itself was becoming a sort of mouthpiece. Number 4, the one we did while we were still at Euston, was largely the work of Warren Chalk. The cover material was drawn by Warren. Much of the material on the sheet on the right was Warren and Ron's work. And all this material referring back to space comics. I can remember Warren and I spending lots and lots of lunch times wandering around the back ends of St. Pancras and anywhere where you could find comics on barrows, and we'd scour these comics to find anything that had cities in it. We weren't interested in whether they had flying machines or whether they were well drawn or badly drawn. We just wanted ones with cities in, and it took weeks of lunchtime research to find piles of cities which were then edited down. And the plug-in city led to looking at a piece of it, the idea of the plug-in university, the institution that not only would change its formality by replacement, but would change its system of teaching by replacement. And there's a diagram which I can't find a slide of or a drawing of, which showed how the thing would eventually become a block of housing, and that the actual institution of the university would phase itself out as everybody was lying in bed and, watching TV, and the bits that were teaching spaces would be replaced by bits that gradually got more and more and more and more domestic until it ended up as sort of just houses. Now that's the sort of early patch concerned with archigram as a build-up, as a totality. And I think then there's the part where it was already known. In other words, up to that point, we were largely sort of in the wilderness, in the dark. We had these occasional sort of paid-for bonanzas, and we had these excuses of working in offices, and we had this excuse of not really quite knowing where we're going, but following certain instinctive leads, and always wanting to upset them, the them being some sort of unspoken English, mainstream, shuttered concrete, nice chap, Hampstead, check-shirted architect thing. At about this time, by which I mean the period of 1966, some of you who were upstairs at a dinner the other night may have remembered me making the profound announcement that next year is 1986. And this, for some of us, has a very, very special historical significance, because it's the 20th anniversary of an event which we held in Folkestone. Now, the reasons for the Folkestone event, and the model, this was a full-size polystyrene-backed wallpaper plastic capsule with Rayner Banham looking out for it, saying prefabricated capsules don't prevent consumer choice, done by hand and wallpaper glue. That was one of the exhibits at this thing called Idea Folkestone, and it's one of these really daft, another daft situation. I'd had the Plug-in City published in the Sunday Times colour supplement, and there was a sort of very scrawny letter that came in the post. It said, "Dear Sir, I'm a great fan of your esteemed Plug-in City, and I live in Folkestone, and I think that the future should all be like this, and Folkestone is the place to do it." And I sort of totally ignored the letter. I thought it's from a complete nutcase. Having ignored the letter for 3 weeks, there was then a much longer letter saying, "Dear Sir, I'm the person that wrote you the letter from Folkestone, and I'm actually an accountant in Folkestone, and I really think that Folkestone is the place that you guys should come and do this thing." Furthermore, the bloke turned, we ignored the second letter, and the bloke showed up and was actually an accountant from Folkestone. And he said, "Folkestone's the place where it should happen. There's a great following for these ideas." And we gave him lunch in the AA and thought that would put paid to it, but it didn't. And further, we were finally, entreaties came to us to go to have a look at Folkestone. And that there's one of these, typically, a lot of you are not English, but you have to realize that this is a very English story, because it's very typical of England that you get an accountant in a ridiculous town who enthuses over a sort of plug-in city of the future and wants it to happen in his town. And so we went, and he said, there's this large art gallery in Folkestone, which indeed there is. And he said, what you should do is an exhibition of these ideas in this large... oh, Christ. Anyhow, he was so persuasive, we couldn't get rid of him. So finally we trotted down one weekend to Folkestone. And indeed, there was a very large art gallery on the top of the cliffs, which had been a hotel. I think there are even people sitting in this room who may well have been there. And he was sort of persuasive, so we thought, what the hell anyway? Let's do this exhibition at Folkestone. And then one's entrepreneurial instincts got slightly out of hand. It seemed, let's not just do an exhibition of our projects. Let's have some of these things by these funny people who write to us and put their schemes in Archigram. It's Folkestone. It's where the ferry goes from. Let's make it international. And then the whole thing mushroomed and got tremendously out of hand. And we finally, a green leaflet was dispatched to all the architecture schools in Europe saying, it's all going to happen at Folkestone. And it said, Buckminster Fuller will be there. The fact was he wasn't going to be there, but we said he was and hoped that he would. And it was the first time that we actually met Hans Hollein in the flesh. He made a brief reference last night to this exhibit when he got shouted down. And people like Jona Friedman and Hans Hollein and Cedric, of course, who by this time had become virtually family, and Banham and various other people, and some extraordinary Frenchmen who did sloping cities turned up with amazingly neat suits. And somehow or other, because it was you cannot believe how cheap it was. The entrance for this weekend thing was £2, and you got the hotel thrown in for another £3. And people actually came on the ferry, and we had 600 people suddenly turning up in Folkestone, of which 300 came from Europe by bicycle and on the ferry, and there were sort of 30 people from the École de Beaux-Arts and 30 people from Ulm and sort of 6 from Stockholm, and blokes camping out on the cliffs and people in plastic suits and tents. Got terribly out of hand, and the French kept chanting and the Germans kept wondering what the program was going to be. And we had to actually sort of clean the room after we'd given our lectures. And it was all very out of hand, but an amazing event. It really was the first of the sort of points at which a lot of people who've subsequently become international friends actually met each other and actually talked to each other and actually showed each other drawings and stuck things onto polystyrene sheets. And so this is the only record I have of it myself, this ridiculous object. Somehow from that point onwards, the whole archigram thing became a kind of, I suppose, something parallel to the old Russian revolutionary trains or something. I mean, it suddenly became faintly show business. And I'm not sure whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I merely report it historically. Meanwhile, I must move on a bit. Meanwhile, these schemes were being done, some of them for underwater, some of them which inflated, and they would always appear published in magazines that subsequently folded. The thing that I've been a story of my life is that just you get, 6 color pages in an amazing new magazine, and the next month it folds. That was the previous scheme, the fold-out, the blow-out village, appeared in something called Woman's Mirror. And it was the last issue of Woman's Mirror. I don't know what people that normally read Woman's Mirror make about blow-out villages, but it didn't sell. And David Green and Mike Webb would make ideas for sort of stories of things for boys at heart, which were in the sky. And there were things for underwater. Warren Chalk did an underwater city. And as you well know, Ron Heron did a walking city. The walking city, I think, is the most perfect and most complete, and surely the most powerful of this whole plethora of schemes. All that I will report is that at and around that time, there are a whole series of these other less perfect schemes for underwater and things that went bang in the night on tops of hills and so on, which were made. David Green's living pod, for instance, which he made whilst teaching at Virginia Polytechnic in the States, was sent in a wooden box so that it could be unveiled in Folkestone. And it was indeed. And so very strange things, were marketed across the world. The little scribbles would go in a letter saying, "We're into pods." And he'd say, "I'm getting my lads to make a pod." And then suddenly a box would arrive. And then sort of Hans Hollein would sort of look at it and say, but we're making tubes in Vienna. And suddenly unveil another cardboard box which had... And I suppose this sort of thing it had overtones of a sort of secret society that had suddenly become public. And there's no doubt about it that the trajectory of the showbiz aspect, the sort of secret society on the one hand that then becomes showbiz, is very important to the whole thing. The idea of the capsule related to the trailer, related to the production car, is something which we can read about. Really is derived from Buckminster Fuller. And all I can say in documentary terms is that there were many, many versions of it. Still, it was Webb who was pushing the thing further. He had fragmented the capsules into being components of more complex structures that depended upon panel systems. Again, of course, reference to Fuller, but at the same time, very, very original work and amazing drawings. things done by Ron and Warren where the idea of the capsule became made possible by the idea of producing gaskets, like car gaskets that you get in a car, strips of form that could be compounded together. Meanwhile, at a slightly more prosaic level, I was carrying on investigating all the systems of locking electric cars into houses and making them into furniture. A lot of very, very straight diagrams, and then sometimes sort of cartoon objects such as this, which was extending the idea of the car to being a village. The conversations were buzzing around in school, by which this time I was now teaching, but one always made one's own version. This version is based on the idea of the popular pack, spelt with a K, the idea that a series of cars would conglomerate on a hillside somewhere, and the structures which they carried would be folded out and made into a series of dwellings that were always rather like a series of sort of moving amoeba, but always in a state of flux. So the village, only for an instant could you freeze the plan of the village, because a few instances later the village would have changed. David made projects concerned with fragmented pods. David and Mike together made projects where the pod folded out into some sort of panel structure. All these things were... There was now a situation where all sort of six of us in the group were constantly producing schemes, sometimes together, sometimes in parallel, sometimes as modifications of the other ideas. And we were beginning to be scattered. For various periods, Mike and David were in the United States, long before the rest of us went there. And then things began to sort of become slightly autobiographical. We began to give performances and lectures in all over the place, and that the idea of what you did when you went on the road as an idea for a replacement or an alternative to a normal, formal academic structure fed the idea of the idea circus, the circus of, well, it's self-explanatory, the idea circus, series of teaching chorales, a main auditorium, offices and services on the backs of trucks. Even reducing the thing down to the... At that time, Sinclair was occasionally brought into juries at the AA, and one had met him a few times. And he was already at that time we're now into the later 60s, talking about the 2-inch television set. And so the infogonks are simply the idea of pulling the 2-inch television set down to the scale of the pair of glasses. And then in '68, we were invited to take part in the Milan Triennale. And we again used the Triennale project as a portmanteau for all these things which we put under almost like a brand name of the Popular Pack. The Popular Pack was our brand name for things about infogonks and blow-up villages and suits that inflated and things that did this and things that did that and moving vehicles and so on. And we designed an enormous inflatable transparent bag about 20 meters long, something of that order, which was built in Italy. And the idea was that we wrapped all these things into it and around it. And there was a sit-in on the day of the opening of the Triennale. And so it was only showed for a matter of hours. But these various things, like the... Hazel remembers it well. These suits and so on. There's P. Cook carrying the suit and wearing the info, or a cheap version of the infogonk on the left, and David Green wearing the David Green inflatable environmental house suit on the right, which was demonstrated on the rooftop of the Triennale building in Milan, much to the general amusement of the much stiffer local architects who wonder what the hell these lads from London were up to. And Mike Webb's Cushicle was happening at around this time was being worked on by him in the States, and drawings were from time to time sent across, and funny photos of people in inflatable suits were sent back to Mike somewhere in Blacksburg, Virginia. And I think I keep referring to the Webb project because you have to realize that these really, I think, are the strongest material of the whole period. I think that really there's no question in my mind that Webb is the key figure of the whole syndrome, in the same way that Pichler, as well as Hollein, is the key figure of the parallel Austrian syndrome. And that probably in his early period, though replaced by Isozaki, certainly Kurokawa was probably the key figure at a certain moment in time in the Tokyo scene. And one was very aware, even then, of what was happening in Vienna and what was happening in Tokyo. There was an active exchange of material going on by the end of the 60s between those three cities. Not America very much, strangely enough. Much more between Vienna and Tokyo and London. Funny projects that happened overnight. That's one I dug out in looking for material for this lecture. I can't even remember quite what we were up to, but it was certainly paid for by Taylor Woodrow, and I think was meant to do something to St. Catherine's Dock, but what the hell it was doing, I have no idea. It seemed a good idea at the time, I think, as a throwaway remark. Upstairs, the Control and Choice project, you will see only in its cartooned form. The idea, we were asked to take part in the Paris Biennale, and the theme of the Biennale was the House of the Future. We were asked simply to design a house of the future. And we said, well, let's make it more an open structure where various different things can come and go and change themselves, and let us make that structure related to a hypothetical family. And I did these cartoons based on this hypothetical family of father, mother, two small kids, elder daughter, uncle and aunt. And all the robot elements and all the funny bits that went bang in the night were meant to be directly related scenographically with this hypothetical family. The discussion is carried on in the drawing on the left, and for a long time I've been interested in the idea of a drawing which chatters, a drawing which almost sort of talks to itself. It says, well, there's more you can do. Well, do we do that? Or perhaps this thing could do that. And it sort of rambles on and draws the bits and pieces at the same time, but doesn't necessarily end up looking like anything. Of course, we had a marvelous incentive for it to end up looking like something, because we had to actually send a model and drawings to the Biennale. So there's no question that we weren't in the end going to produce something that looked like something, even if it didn't look like anything anybody knew what it looked like, but it looked like something. It was a thing. And the thing was a cage which would provide the matrix for a series of phase changes. These are just some of the diagrams of the plans for these phase changes, and a bit more of the cartoon diagram upstairs, which is the sort of explanation cartoon. And then finally the actual model itself, which is a very glossy object, which of course is by now you begin to recognize some of the parts. The electric car track, which by this time had been worked over in several other projects. The idea of moving walls, the cage, the satellite house that tracks out on its own vehicle and becomes a satellite of the base house, and so on and so on. We were very lucky. It travelled successfully to Paris and was shown for however long the Biennale is on. It came back to London and it was shown at an Ideal Home exhibition in Olympia. And then some Burke dropped it as it was coming out of Olympia, and we opened the box, I think probably in the AA. We found just this heap of plastic and bits of stick, and we didn't have the heart it was just too much bother to rebuild it. So it only exists in photographs. Otherwise, I'm sure by now it would be sitting in the Architecture Museum in Frankfurt. a little later, we were asked to do a full-scale House of the Future, which is sounds quite a tall order, but of course it was done in cardboard and plywood. I mean, it wasn't. It was full-scale, but it wasn't real materials. And it basically incorporates many of the same ideas. And this was built in Harrods and had a moving robot. I have to admit that the robot moved on a rail and quite frequently broke down. In fact, it was more often broken down. And D. Crompton would be dispatched to Harrods with a screwdriver to desperately try and make the thing work again. And I remember Warren and I going around aeroplane graveyards looking for hydraulic plungers. God knows why we were sent to, but somehow or other, I can remember us spending afternoons going around these airplane graveyards looking for bits that still worked hydraulically. We came back with a sort of job lot of these bits. I think the reason why the robot didn't work terribly well was that half of them, had been shot in the war and actually were never going to work again. I mean, the story of these activities is full of ridiculous inglese situations, which may not be very funny, but seemed funny at the time. There were robots called Fred, I suspect because Fred Scott was by this time teaching at the AA, and a robot called James, because another of our friends was James Mellor, who's a sort of person that some of you know. And some of them, the inflatable bed was in the end made of static plastic because we ran out of money. But we had marvellous photographs taken by people like Donovan for publication, which this was sponsored by the Sunday Telegraph colour supplement and appeared in glorious double-page colour in the Telegraph, but didn't always work, so that it was a little bit of a pictorial thing. The other thing you may notice is that I keep flipping from the model of the thing to the actual thing. And there were various adjunct schemes. I mean, you see, you get these larger things that occupy weeks and weeks and weeks of collecting bits of hydraulics or doing working drawings or whatever. And then there are other things which are commentaries really upon your own work. This is another conversation piece. This is actually saying, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a house that was as free as what happens when somebody surfs on a surfboard? And that's all that diagram is really talking about. And perhaps you could do it with electrics and arms, and then maybe we don't quite know what you do. And you couldn't do that in Harrods or anywhere else, but you could do it on sort of 2 sheets of cardboard, maybe. These are other sort of adjunct schemes. This is I think it's a Ron, I can't remember if it's a David Green or Ron Heron, I think it's a Ron Heron project for a tree that actually contains house apparatus. And the one on the right is an interior project that I did with a sort of very modified robot. I can't remember what it was for. I can't remember why I did it, but there it is, I did it. And then we move on to things like the Instant City. Now, by this time we're into 1968, after the Triennale, and it was another portmanteau project. It was the collecting together of a whole lot of ideas about performance spaces, inflatables, enclosures, electric or electronic jukeboxes, ideas about mobilized elements, and so on and so on. And I proposed it for a field, any field in sort of southern England, and that, again, rather like, it's a blown-up version of the Ideas Circus, that a whole series of trucks would carry the apparatus, would arrive at a place, drop it out. It was based on sort of county fairs and mobilized universities, and the idea that the metropolis could go to your small town. The idea was that any town in the country could become a metropolis for a week. It was an extension of, if you like, the Warhol or what's his name? Forgotten. Gutenberg Galaxy thing. forgotten the man's name, Canadian, who the idea that you could become famous for 5 minutes. This is, sorry? McLuhan, right, thanks. The Marshall McLuhan notion that you could be, you could become famous for 5 minutes. In this case, your town could become metropolitan for a week, and then the metropolis would move on. And the drawing, which you see in its original state up on the wall, because the colored one is now in Tokyo, the elevation drawing, I mean, it's always interesting to me, just to talk very briefly about drawings, that my usual process is to spend much more time working on the plan, which is never as an attractive a drawing. I mean, it's a messy drawing, this one. It's sort of, the fact that it's collaged onto green cardboard probably was part of the problem. But it is, of course, the elevation drawing, the picture drawing, which actually was done much more quickly, that is the one that is clearly the image. And it's always, as a sort of drawing architect, it's always something of a paradox in my mind, that the drawing that you actually spend all the sweat on, where all the thinking goes, isn't in itself a particularly attractive thing. And its product, its progeny, which is by that time quite easy to draw. I mean, you just start at the left-hand side and bang on till you reach the right-hand side. It takes probably about 3 days to draw, no more, is the one that everybody looks at, and the plan is forgotten, and even the plan isn't thought to be worthy of putting up on the exhibition. Not that I've got it, I don't know what's happened to it. I just mentioned that in passing. All these diagrams, the trajectory of the instant city, where it would go, how it would leave behind a trail of networks that would begin to join up, and therefore at a certain point, maybe in the second or third year, you'd simply phase the caravan out. And the fact that the Woodstock Pop Festival was happening at around the same time is actually doing, as far as the fabric, as far as the hardware is concerned, it's actually doing the thing that one was drawing. I mean, without having seen it beforehand, once you got the photographs of Woodstock, you realize that the actual imagery was very, very close. It was actually happening. This is the point. And we made models, and we made collages, and we made more models. What's happened to that photograph? And more collages, and applied it to one's hometown. And Ron applied it to California, which is where he found himself at that time. And curiously, I was also in California for part of the time I was drawing the project. And it's a very odd thing where the project started as with a very, very specific sort of English idea, English feel to it. But one was actually drawing the drawings of the English site while sitting in Los Angeles. And you realize at that point, that's the first time I realized myself, that you actually take yourself with you. That the idea transcends actually where you happen to be doing it. You know, it's just a slightly different size of drawing board. Oh. Oh. Is that a stuck slide then? Must be. Or are we flipping trays? I'm not sure. Can we just bang on to the next one, Chris? Ah. And people were talking about airships in the AA, and this is the first time I can consciously remember a sort of inside AA conversation feeding back to the project. People were talking a lot about airships, and I suddenly thought, my God, wouldn't it be much cooler if instead of all these trucks trundling through the town and poles coming out of them, it all being very, very boring, if you simply, in your little town, in the middle of the night, you just heard a low hum of a motor, and it stopped. And then the next morning, drew the curtain, and there it was. That was much more heroic, much more marvelous. And so these bits and pieces were done in respect of that idea that you could have your little town infiltrated from above, from the airship. That the airship itself, we made an enormous wooden and paper, model aircraft type model of the airship. This was made at another, I mustn't warble on about these events too much, but there was an extraordinary thing. Before he became head of the AA, Alvin Boyarsky, who at that time was assistant dean at Chicago Circle, would come back to London, or would come over to London, and started a thing called the Summer Session. And the first one was held up at the Bartlett. He hired the Bartlett for the summer, and a whole lot of us, almost everybody you can think of in London, and a lot of the old sort of people who'd first showed up at Folkestone found their way there. It was like a sort of continuation of the same party. And we had these strange sort of class, I don't know whether they were formal classes, but I mean, Piers Goff was one of the students working on the airship, and it was a whole sort of funny mixture of people. And I, as one of my sort of tasks, in addition to vaguely tutoring, I made the airship so that the sort of tutor, you do a sort of the odd tutorial here, and then you say, hang on a minute, we'll just glue up a few more pieces of airship, and then I'll carry on with the tutorial. I suppose it hasn't changed that much. And the model was made and illustrated how this thing would work. Ron Heron himself made his own drawing, his own version of the Instant City airship on the right. And then come three projects, which I'm not sure quite how closely after the Instant City, but pretty closely. We entered a competition in Monte Carlo for an entertainment centre, and it was a sort of eliminator competition. You had to sort of get into the second stage, which we did. And we did a project for this entertainment centre, which was to be on this reclaimed piece of land. Monte Carlo being very small, they keep reclaiming bits of land to make it bigger. And we said, and I'm sure everybody expected us to do another sort of Instant City thing, because Instant City had been published by that time. And everybody expected it to have sort of gantries and balloons and, all that. We said, no, not like that. It will be hidden in the ground. We will make a hole in this park, this precious piece of open space, shouldn't be cluttered up by a lot of crap or a building. It should be left as a park. It's very precious. Let's put the entertainment centre as a mysterious object, a black box virtually, in the ground. And we produced this project, and we won the competition. And for the next 2 or 3 years, we spent an enormous amount of time working on the building with Frank Newby as our engineer. And they never built it, but we spent a great deal of time on it. One of the ideas was that the top of the hidden building, the park, would actually be riddled at every 2 meters by a little hole, rather like a golf hole, and that you would be able to rent a special stick you could plug into the hole, and the stick would contain a water supply, an air conditioning supply, and a small television monitor that would show you what was going on inside the hall, which was hidden under the ground. The idea was that this park would just have this 2-meter matrix of golf holes. And particularly David Green was involved with that, and Ron Heron. And David did the collage on the left, and Ron did the collage on the right. And you can see the golf hole, as we called it, in operation. That sort of golf, it never got talked about in the meetings we had once we won the competition. I mean, it's very, very clearly indicated on all the competition drawings, and they still gave us the first prize. But once it got to sort of contracts and working drawings on it, somehow the sort of golf holes disappeared. But these drawings show very clearly, I think, the basic idea of the scheme. The hidden room would, in effect, become the architecture that was made by the producer of the show. These are some competition drawings. We had a very, very highly systematized competition production. We produced 57 drawings for the competition. And we produced our own letter set. We produced all the components of the scheme were produced on plastic sheets, so that we showed 12 different arrangements of the space by a plan and a collage, and these are just some of them. For instance, this is the one with the banquet, where the space becomes a single space. We had mobile toilets and offices and robots and so on. Again, a 2-meter grid of outlet points all over the floor of the building. And this shows the rows and rows of banqueting seating and some audio-visual spectacle and service and toilets and so on and so on. And this is a collage, I think a David Green collage actually, of people enjoying themselves at the banquet. We did so many drawings that the whole thing had to be incredibly highly organized. I think we had, in the end, about 10 people working on the drawings, although there were basically 3 of us who did the scheme. And we even had a sort of collage bank. We had somebody whose job it was purely to collect the collage elements and sort of animals and heads and people dancing and things. Great piles and piles. And we printed our own coloured title. I mean, we really went to town on the whole thing and the box. But we actually finished a day ahead of schedule, which I always remember. I mean, I think it's a very good sort of omen to actually win a competition, which is to finish a day ahead of schedule. We all went to the cinema, and then the next morning we hung it up in the AA and photographed it and invited our friends round to look at the scheme before it went off. I mean, it sounds terribly arrogant, but I don't think we sort of sniffed success. I mean, we just, for once, were incredibly highly organized, and the thing sort of clocked into place. Because I think because the proposition was very simple. I think it's one of the simplest propositions one's ever made, which is that the building will be hidden, it will be totally organized by this totally mobile system plugged into 2-meter increments, and that therefore the production of the drawings, in a sense, mimicked the way the thing happened. It would be made of all these components, which could be arranged around, and therefore glue, or the adhesive back of the stick-on element, became in a sense, the paradigm of the actual process. This is a circus. Again, you start to recognize the standard parts. Oh. And I don't know what the next. Then I think the next project is a competition that we did very shortly afterwards, again for my hometown, which is Bournemouth, which had a very oh no, it's not. It's the indoor sports part of Monte Carlo. And then after we won the competition, as inevitably happens, there were changes made to the brief. They actually wanted something to show. They wanted a main entrance. And this is a much later plan drawing, where you can see that things begin to sprout out, and the building, though still mainly hidden in the ground, isn't quite as hidden as it was, which I think was a pity. There was another Monte Carlo project which we were invited into and didn't get anywhere, which was for the summer casino. And I think it's interesting to me because it was the beginning of the sort of vegetable period. Just faint hints of the vegetable architecture mixing with the sort of machine architecture starts to happen. And this drawing is an interesting one because the right-hand part of it was done by Bernard Tschumi. It's the only time I've ever worked with Bernard on a competition, and it was, even at that point, very obvious that he was extraordinarily talented and a very interesting person to work with. Another thing we did was we actually did 2 entries for the competition. Ron Heron Colin Fournier and I think Dennis Crompton were one of the teams, and Bernard and I and another guy were the other team. And we actually had these two rival schemes going on in the office at the same time. So I don't know quite why we did that, but another piece of arrogance maybe. The Bournemouth scheme, we presented, it was a very odd competition which had to be presented to the whole of the town council and to a whole lot of sort of investment people. And when we got into the second stage, we then we got a bit of money from somewhere and put it into presenting the whole scheme in the form of plastic attaché cases. And the A at that time had a vacuum forming machine, and we vacuum formed all the models of the site and then silk screened all the plans on top of the vacuum formed model. So every member of the town council had this attaché case with this 3D model, and then had a set of slides and a flip-out viewer, and then a guidebook from which 2 sheets are pinned up in the upstairs. We didn't win the competition because it was all rigged, as we found afterwards. But there is the there's the production. There are a series of the cases with the books inside, etc. And the scheme was very much for inserting into the ground, but it was totally different in spirit from the Monte Carlo scheme. I mean, that's the only similarity. The Monte Carlo scheme was very, very doctrinaire. It was very tough. It was very ordered. Once we had set the notion of the black box and the system, we stuck to it ruthlessly, viciously, and we were very determined. This was a fruity scheme, and it was done in 3 weeks by 9 people at great speed, and anything went. You know, somebody had an idea for this, so we put it in, and the drawings were done by many different hands. It was full of sort of crumbly bits and fruity bits and nets and things hanging out and piers and land piers and searchlights in the middle of the night and things that popped out through the trees. And it was a real dog's dinner. It's the only scheme of ours, I think, that Charlie Jenks has really ever liked. There are, of course, inevitably in a scheme done at that speed, a few things that are thrown up that one sticks with. I still like the idea, whatever it might be, of the land pier. And you must bear in mind that this was done on a site now, which I knew incredibly well. It's very funny when you do a scheme on a site that you really know well. If you do a scheme in Monte Carlo or America or wherever the hell it might be, you have to study the maps. You have to actually read the statistics and bother with the sections and actually say, well, if they tell us that everybody crosses over the street there, it must be true. Here you know why people don't walk one side of the street. You know why certain kinds of old ladies sit on a certain seat. You know why everybody always crosses over at that point because there's an ice cream shop on the other side. You know why people don't like that group of trees but do like this group of trees. And it has a funny effect on you. It either makes you terribly worried, terribly concerned. You say, you can't possibly do that there because... Or you say, because I know it well, we can really do something funny here. You know, let's and takes that sort of, if you like, sort of view. Odd thing slipped in. A scheme we produced once proposing an exhibition for the ICA called The Magic Mushroom. I can't remember quite what it was meant to do, but again, it seemed a good idea at the time. And they hadn't got the money for it, so it never happened. So it never existed except in this sort of funny model. And the idea of it, well, you can read the thing on the right. I don't know whether one, when people are cataloguing projects, I don't know whether you count a thing on the right as a scheme, and it you know, goes down in history as number 163B, or whether it was me just having a sort of... It was just, it's one of these things where one chatters on the paper. It's another example of chattering on the piece of paper, I think. Then there are schemes which are talking about housing. And if you notice, things are beginning to get a bit more autobiographical again. We're back to the England as we know and love it, the suburban scene. a very typical piece of suburbia where perhaps the odd architect has appeared. You can just see hints of architectural insertion in number 2. It happens a little bit more by number 3, and somebody starts converting their house a little more energetically and hanging a picture of a German castle out in the back garden instead of looking at the neighbour's washing. And then by number 4, there is rather more ambitious. Somebody's been to Spain for their holiday, and they've replaced the German castle by a piece of electrical Japanese work in the garden. And then by number 5, it's getting highly ambitious, and there's sort of prefabricated Gothic and other nasty things happening. And the scheme took on its own trajectory. You get to number 6 and you say, Christ, I can't go on. This has got totally out of hand. And in fact, the only person in number 6 to have retained their sanity is the guy here, I think, who has done nothing. He's just stayed in his house. What it was all about was about prefabrication. And in fact, it was based upon that kit of standard elements. In fact. And I extended the scheme in a more modest and perhaps po-faced and practical and reasonable project, which was using the same basic ideas to a corner in Notting Hill Gate. The idea was that you took this corner, which was in a dilapidated state and somewhere in the Pembridge area, and you then did a few things to it in a modest way. I don't know whether I do it like that. Now it makes it look worse to me. Be that as it may. Extensions of the same idea was this chatter. It's this sort of halfway between a chatter project and a practical project, which says, what will happen to our town, it says. And it chatters on. I don't know what's happened to the coloured version. It's probably long since lost, but there is a little tiny version upstairs on the wall. It chatters away about the metamorphosis of the town. Later says things, loose floppy skins, bugged with sound, cheek by jowl, which has always been one of my favourite phrases. I thought it's always my favourite idea about architecture, things happening cheek by jowl, you know, the like with the unlike and so on. Cannibalizing, cheek by jowl again. There's a lot. Sometimes one designs a project by thinking of the phrase first and then working around it. I find the bits of loose language terribly useful. Like the urban mark. Now, the urban mark started off life actually as an entry to a competition run by Casabella magazine called, very pompously, The City as a Significant Environment. And I was terribly slow, which is fairly unusual for me. I was terribly slow doing the competition and never finished it in time, and I just went on with it slowly. And I called it The City as a Responsive Environment. And it was looking back, because by now it's 1972, and Plug-in City was already, by that time, 8 years old. Looking back at Plug-in City and saying, what would happen if a sort of Plug-in City established itself on a piece of site very similar to the Monte Carlo site? If you look carefully at the configuration of the land, you'll recognize that it's actually the site of the Monte Carlo building. And if you look carefully at some of the bits of the building, you see that it is some sort of looser, developed, slightly hippie plug-in city. And it is established in slide 1. And it starts to, it also is concerned with heroics. It starts to change. It becomes less ordered, and naughty things start to happen. People start building uncomfortable huts, and then some of the more formal building is replaced by less formal building. I think these slides are slightly out of order. It's the second stage is the right-hand one, the third stage is the left-hand one. But you see it upstairs, you know what's going to happen. And in the end, it disintegrates into being a kind of moon landscape. And my scenario is two alternatives. Either the civilization that started off with this very mechanistic city has died out, and there isn't any architecture left because there isn't any civilization left. Or alternatively, that the civilization that has been replacing itself with this much softer, gentler one is a much more developed, much higher form of civilization. I leave the storyline as two open options. I mean, knowing me, I know which is the actual storyline. Byproducts happened of it. That funny drawing on the right, I'm sticking in a lot of things that I didn't dare put up on the wall or couldn't find. The drawing on the right is actually a very early version of the urban mark. I don't know what happened to it, but it was an early version with lots of sort of palm trees and squiggles. And the drawings that you see upstairs, by comparison, are much more ordered. I think it was very pictorial in its early stages, and then I sort of cooled it down and reduced it down and then started again. Sometimes one works in that way. Now, one of the byproducts was the vegetable building that you see in detail here that occurs on the urban mark drawings. And what happens is then a pursuit of the idea of the vegetable building, the story of the secret garden, borrowed from the children's book, the idea that having found the key to the garden, the children open the door and see this place, which is neither animal, mineral, nor vegetable, but is a scaleless object, perhaps some sort of building. And my own observation, and it was used as a Casabella cover, as you know, and my own observation afterwards is that even trying to be childlike, even trying to detach myself from all the constraints of consistency and scale and so on, in the end it is an architect's drawing. I noted my own self-criticism would be that it is an architect's drawing. It has a certain consistency of the parts. It has a certain hierarchy, and it ends up looking a bit too much like a building for a children's story. But pursuing this idea of the abstracted, the non-loaded object, I was very interested in the idea of the lump. The lump started off as a mound, but became a lump because a lump is a much more casual term. It's not a heap, it's not a pile, it's not a mound, it's a lump. It's just something. And I looked at the difference between the hierarchic pile, like Mont Saint-Michel, or just a lump of stuff. And in the slide library some years ago, they found this old picture done by an English watercolorist called Hurst Walker. And the picture, amazingly, is titled, "I Love a Lump." So I've always kept the slides since. I don't know who Hurst Walker was. Well, you walk around the lump and you start to recognize bits of sort of architecture creeping out in amongst the bushes. I've always been interested in this idea of architecture as a sort of objet trouvé in amongst natural form. And sooner or later, as you track right round it, you find, in fact, that it is a building the whole time because it's got a proper entrance and windows and things. So actually, what starts off as something detached from the idea of being architecture is, in the end itself, architecture. This is a later version, a sort of self-parody, because it looked so much like one of those things that you see in westerns that I actually did a version which makes it really look like a thing in the Arizona, with the guy riding round and gunfire coming from the top of it. I've never seen Ayers Rock. I suppose I ought to have done, but also the interior of the lump is a problematic thing. Another idea I've been interested in for years and years, and you'll see more of that tomorrow night, is the idea of the building that starts off by being completely transparent, and in a imperceptible progression goes from total transparency to translucent and nearly transparent to just translucent to more opaque to more opaque to more opaque to solid. And this, I think I drew it around the same time. It gets buggered up as soon as you start making it expressionistic. It will recur in the Via Appia project. But that was sort of going on in my mind at the same time. This is the version called Peter Cook in his Captain Nemo mood, which is one version of the inside of the lump. And then the idea of lump architecture, this sort of vegetable architecture, coexisting with office block architecture. And the analogy that I always use in describing that is scrambled egg on toast, which is that if you think of the standard office block architecture as the toast, uptight, stiff, ordered, and the lump architecture is the scrambled egg, which, as you know, if you make scrambled egg on toast, it never sits completely comfortably. It sort of soaks in and droops over the side insidiously. And this is the relationship proposed between the standard office block architecture and the lump architecture. The lump architecture is slightly a threat to the reasonableness of the office block. And there's a plan of it. Again, in fact, one spent longer on the plan, but it's not as attractive a drawing. Here's the standard office block architecture, slightly fragmented, but with normal things like concrete columns and escalators and toilets and so on. And the lump architecture lying over it in some funny way. That's just I found that one looking through the slides. I'm showing you from time to time some funny old ones. This is an early version of the lump, which was then banished. And of course the existence of real things in the manner of the formal architectonic object in amongst the natural landscape. Years later, I was taken by some German friends to see the Maginot Line. And in amongst the Maginot Line, you find a lot of these actual happenings. Meanwhile, projects being done, I can't remember, I think that's a Ron Heron underwater project. I think that's a project I did for Earl's Court. Don't ask me why, I can't remember what the program was. I found the slide, somebody stole the drawing from an exhibition. And it was for an underground exhibition centre which only showed itself partly above ground. And then comes all the stuff controversial at around this time, early 70s, was the proposal for a third London airport in the Essex marshes. And a city, I think it was going to be 85,000 people. And I said, you don't need to have this city. What you can do is to hide it all in amongst the area. And you have a network of what I call crater cities, which would be about 16,000 people a shot in a single rim of a crater. But hidden, you wouldn't see them because they'd be in the crater, right? You'd only see it if you lived in it. And they were about a third of a mile across. And then you'd have hedgerow villages all over the place. Behind the hedgerow would be another few thousand people living in succession of mysterious places. And you could get the whole of these 85,000 people scattered around the back end of Southend marshes without anything being visible as you drove past. And here's the crater city. Here's the section through the crater city. It's about a 20-story crater rim with well-carpeted apartments and an absolutely immaculately mowed lawn, a third of a mile across. So I was actually being very rationalist. I mean, I didn't know I was a rationalist, but clearly that's what I was in that piece of the scheme. There was just a sort of extended version of Chanctonbury Ring sitting on the edge of the crater. This is a half plan of the top of the crater. It's a half plan bottom of the crater. I've lost the drawing. I don't know what's happened to the drawing. Still got the slide. And here is the hedgerow village, as Christine in her piece describes it as similar to the Start Right shoe advertisement. An ordinary place, an ordinary country lane, and the typical British worker cycling home at sort of 4:30 in the afternoon in a gabardine raincoat, and nothing apparently happening except, behind the hedge is this rather sort of hippie community. You've got to put it into period, of course. And the other thing about the community itself, it's a very liberal community. There's a sort of smart apartment with Venetian blinds and a sort of Mercedes parked somewhere just off the picture. And then there's a sort of latter-day plug-in, there's a sort of coloured caravan with the plate glass window and so on. There's an architectural student, because it's all made of sort of triangulated bits and, you know, a bit of a vent and so on. Then there's a sort of hillbilly living next, and then there's the sort of conceptual artist who's mapped out the place where you would put the enclosure, but it's only a conceptual enclosure, so he sleeps in a sleeping bag. And then there's the camper, and all these bizarre people. God knows how it would work sociologically, but this bizarre group of people found themselves living next to each other. And there would be orchard places, which would be little orchards that turn themselves into villages. I was very interested in the analogy between the orchard and the megastructure. I can remember at the time saying, you know, really, an orchard with chickens running around it is like a megastructure, because the orchard trees act as the structure and the chickens are mobilized. There were lots of funny projects. AD asked me for a magazine cover once, and I did a sort of house in a hedge, and a ditch house. I can't remember the program for the ditch house, but somehow you would put housing in amongst ditches. It might be quite damp, actually. And then the drawing that you see up on the landing, which started off life as a mural done in the Edinburgh Festival at the Richard DeMarco Gallery. But that's, I mean, if I go on telling the details of that, we'll be here for another hour. So I'll move quickly on. Suffice it to say that I think that the drawings of the prepared landscape are very self-explanatory. It is again the idea of the organized and mechanized building finding itself tucked into the landscape. Unlike Monte Carlo, which is a completely hidden object, or some of the other projects, which is the object with little bits poking out, this is the total object, exposed to the sky, but still dropped into a fold in the landscape. And that's really the distinction between it and the other projects. Odd schemes that have never seen the light of day. A project, I've forgotten even what the name of it is. I swapped it with a drawing from a friend of mine in Copenhagen. I've never seen it again. Can't even remember what the scheme is, but I just show it to you because it sort of was going on. This scheme was an idea for a carpet system, which was that if you had a basic central carpet, you could have a very ordinary room, and you could do almost anything with a series of additional carpets. So you had the basic central carpet, and then you had bench carpets where you could sit around listening to this person who would pontificate. And then this is a slightly abrasive carpet where you could sort of sit and rub your back. And this is a vibromassage carpet, which is made of some sort of rubbery substance. And the idea was that these carpets could be attached to each other and would have electric lighting built in the side of them. And then, of course, sponge, which you see upstairs, which again attempts to be a sort of portmanteau. It brings together a series of bits and pieces of idea for orifices, for windows, for the idea of a hard architecture surrounded by a softer architecture. And it has a direct relationship to a competition scheme which we did for a university building in Trondheim, which I will talk about tomorrow. But at this point, we're now at 1975, I was interested in collecting together a series of ideas for vocabulary parts that didn't have to attach themselves to a program. I knew that later I would use them, but at this point I wanted to make almost like a sort of catalogue of parts. And so the sponge project has that characteristic, and I think the latest project, the Waft project, has that same role. It is a sort of cataloguing. It is a catalogue of elements waiting for future reference to be applied to programmed projects. It has all these gunges and gardens and sides of buildings and mixtures of vegetable and ordinary. Oh, I've used that one twice. And at the same time, around the same time, was being produced the Archigram book, which Diana Jowsey made this collage of various Archigram projects for. And at around this time, I was beginning to organize a thing called ArtNet, which was a gallery and a meeting place, mostly for architects, which was around the corner in Bloomsbury. And at a later stage in the sponge drawing, Christine Hawley and Jerry Whale helped me make this giant painting. It's the first time I've made a sort of very large drawing, a drawing which is about from here to there, of an elevation of a project. It's the first time we put together the bits of the sponge vocabulary, the patchwork, the orifices, the gunge, and so on, put it together in this thing that looks a bit like a landscape, but is actually the elevation of a building. And the drawing that you see upstairs over the fireplace is actually the section through the same building. And at that point, one was teaching, the unit system had started in the A, and one was teaching a particularly talented group of students. And Peter Eisenman had come over to ArtNet and had given a lecture and said, by the way, we've got a competition coming up in New York. You guys could enter it through the Institute. It's for Roosevelt Island, which is an island parallel to Manhattan. It's, I think, about 1.5 miles long. It's for housing. And we said, hey, what a great idea. And we, for some reason, Ron Heron and Ingrid Morris and I, who were teaching together, hit upon the idea of doing the competition with a group of students. And we did an extremely naughty thing. We siphoned off 6 people from the unit who we thought were the 6 best students. I suspect much to the annoyance of the rest of the unit. And we did the competition together. But the point I must make very, very clearly, and it's absolutely straight up, is that it was not a hierarchical thing. I mean, the typical thing that you particularly meet in say, Germany is where Herr Professor and his assistant round up 3 or 4 students. The bloody students are doing all the, you know, the scratching art and the hatching and the so on, all the sort of things that you guys are doing, helping me airbrush upstairs. But in the case of the Roosevelt, we didn't do it that way. We actually all did the scheme. And I can only report, without going into minute detail, that of the 9 people, more or less, let's say, 5 people did the designing. But that 5 were not the teachers particularly. It was a scrambled set of people who actually worked on the design. Again, being a 9-person operation, it had to be very highly organized. Again, Frank Newby was the engineer. Frank is a marvelous person to work with on competitions because he's a very, very good architectural critic, not just a good engineer. And it's always a very nice experience working on a competition with Frank there in the background. We also were working in ArtNet on the upper floor whilst the Creer brothers were putting together their exhibition on the lower floor. And I mention that as a historical. It has nothing to do with Creer architecture, but it's interesting that they were spending a week putting up their exhibition downstairs, and we were working on the competition upstairs, and occasionally they would saunter up and have a look at what we were doing, and occasionally we'd saunter down and have a look at what they were doing. And this was the scheme, which we got placed in but didn't win. The scheme is to do with it's very much a sort of English version of Americana. What we decided was that in a scheme that is lying alongside Manhattan with all its powerfulness, that we would do something that was even more sort of powerful than American architecture. And those of you who may remember an architect called Edward D. Stone will know what I mean when I say we wanted to make it more Ed Stone than Ed Stone, more sort of bland and machined and Louvre-like and detail-less than Stone on the outside, but to actually contain a sort of spooky vertical garden city on the inside. And if you look at the apartment plans and at this piece of section, you see that the actual Jekyll and Hyde quality of the building is directly reflected in the organization. On the outside, it is sleek and air-conditioned and bland and louvered. And then gradually, as you move in, it gets sort of spookier and more personalized. And the idea was that the actual internal elevations would be virtually put together by the people who lived in them. And it has gardens and places where you can walk the dog and bushes and so on on the inside. And the, again, really reference back to some of the archigram things, the kitchen elements and toilet elements could be attached more or less anywhere along the party wall conditions. It was quite a different way of teaching. The way of teaching for that particular group was that you sat there drawing, because you were all drawing, you were all singing, you were all, buying cheap Yugoslav Riesling and all that, everything that happens during the time of a 7-week competition. These are the axonometrics of the various house types. ArtNet, just to backtrack into time, was an extraordinary, funny place. We had these, this is a real time warp photograph. There are probably people who are sitting in this room in that photograph. Certainly there's Tom Hennigan at a youthful age, for example. The group of students, by the way, consisted of Christine Hawley and Tom Hennigan and John Robbins and Penny Richards, all of whom are or have at some time themselves then become tutors at the AA. And Jerry Whale, who did the Screen on the Hill entrance, for those of you who know that. And it was a very interesting experiment, which curiously we haven't repeated. I don't quite know why we haven't repeated it. It's considered a dangerous thing to do, to siphon off a group of students and not actually sort of teach them by teaching that way, but actually sit there sort of swearing and drawing and throwing paper darts and so on. It works under certain conditions. Anyway, there is ArtNet, and there are various famous and less famous people at various ArtNet events, some of which were extremely serious events. And it was, at its moment, the first place that the Kriers exhibited in England. It was the first place that Daniel Libeskind ever exhibited. It was the first place that the New York Five actually came and gave lectures at, and became quite heroic and famous till we ran out of money. And then it folded. That's the brief history of the thing. But what you have to understand at a biographical level is that, in a sense, the Archigram office, which by that time had run out of work because they hadn't built Monte Carlo or very few of the other things that we did, was for my external activities being replaced by this place called ArtNet, which put on a lot of shows and performances. And this, in a sense, I think is it the last slide? Yeah? Yeah. It marks a transition point between this evening and tomorrow, which is the old Archigram group, though photographed after Archigram had formally stopped, during the making of the Boberg film, while looking at Richard Rogers' building in Paris, with Cedric, who has always been a very, very close, as I say, a very close member of the family. Never formally a member of Archigram, although a lot of foreign journalists have ascribed him to be, but always there as a sort of conscience and friend and ally, a very special relationship with I and my cronies. And then a sort of symbolic photograph, in a sense, on the left-hand side, done when we visited Helsinki. Because I think in the subsequent period to Archigram and ArtNet, one has found more and more of one's time spent outside England. And it's also a nice photograph because my partner, Christine Hawley, on that occasion, we'd just finished doing a competition with Ron Heron, who, after all, was her teacher for 4 years of her time at the A, and himself, of course, was my earlier partner and part of Archigram. So there is this feeling, and perhaps I'm being a bit sentimental at the end of this evening, saying that there is a continuous thread running that always runs on between the scene, and, of course, a funny thread that runs from the place and the circumstances. I think there will be no doubt at all that tomorrow evening you will find more and more of the projects are located in foreign cities with foreign references. Many of the schemes, of course, have been done with Chris. That the Archigram series of interests has only sort of re-emerged very lately. Whether there is more consistency than that, I cannot say. I'm merely here almost as a sort of history lecturer, gazing at one's own navel. Thank you for putting up with it for so long. I'll try and be quicker tomorrow night.
It was 63 or so, a little bit before Olympic Stadium completed. And this is the prefecture library of the remote town, which I was born. Because of this kind of connection, I got this commission. And the idea is still metabolist ideas. Metabolist idea is maybe there are in the building or the cities, there are some elements which has to stay longer, and some parts of the element and building could be changeable, replaceable. And so you remember a vertical cylinder with plugged-on capsule. It is vertical one is permanent. It's like an infrastructure, and added part are houses and elements which can be disposable. So those are the what Archigram people developed many this kind of concept many ways. So, but we didn't know much about London situation, but very very different ways for the real to create real building. We just started to do to work. So there are two pair of the in the middle columns, and the walls, pair walls, and from walls both sides those unit elements are projected according to the each functional organizations. So this was the 1960s idea, and that shot was 1966, and this is of course the same building, same element, but just 10 years ago I had to renovate by myself because of after the big earthquake we had last 20, 30 years, and building code for earthquake changed. We have to add more seismic element for the building. So the problem of reinforced concrete made Professor Suzuki suffering of this kind of concept, because before the 1960s, buildings are weak, and no, according to present building code, it is impossible to to stay. So I added, keeping same surface, same proportion, but according to the new seismic regulations. And the things, and what I did was, I digged on one side 5 meters and all the way, and poured concrete as a kind of a heavy concrete underground to keep the movement of the building stable. So very heavy. I don't remember how much tons. Maybe 30 ton, 50 ton of the concrete blocks are underground. So through that kind of way, it was. They said, okay, then can be approved for the new building code. And this was built in 71, but the bank, which I had the first project commissions after that library. That library's idea, exactly same way, there are one pair walls and covered by Indian and red sandstone, and project on both sides, kind of very similar to the libraries project. And still, I think this is an idea based on metabolism and same original building. And that bank is not so, ideated as exactly same to that. And as I said, Japanese natural light condition inside interior of building are very different from, of course, upside down things we talked. And that's the reason all the natural light comes horizontally or bounced light, reflecting on the garden and coming up inside and through the shoji screens and bounce again and so on, coming all deep inside the building. There are almost darkness. And the major point is we have no skylight in the history. We have no upper side windows much. So I try to first to introduce this natural light condition for this building, because just when I was working this building, until that time I never be outside of Japan. I never saw Western traditional building, and I visited, moved around to many places, and I found major difference is this kind of situation of natural light. So I changed my scheme after I did finish the design development. Again, I started once more to get this natural light. And also introduce the very bright colors. And so, and in the middle of, it's okay. Sorry, so I go more quick. In the middle, Japanese government decided to build Osaka to design a world fair. And Kenzo Tange, again, he was a master planner and supervisor directing all that. And we are the team working on the major part, so-called festival part. This was my very early project, which the 300-meter long box has a kind of skin, and inside the robot, it is 30 meters high, and so on, so on. And I was working. That time, I found very interesting similar concept which Cedric Price already produced here in London. And this is the Cedric Price idea for the fan palace, he called. And really I surprised such an idea was already done here. So this is my drawings, according to this kind. All the movable seating element, robots, walk on the floor to change the part of the space for the big performances. And this is a robot which and it is realized, but it is 50-meter high, very high and big, 30 ton in weight, very heavy one. Because today Japan is famous to building a robot, but that time nobody accepts to build our ideas. So I did the very early stage similar of the Akigram's proposal, but they said no, those are impossible. So I came back very simple against the cube and spheres and so on. And this is also Friedman's idea. And Kenzo Tangechi built this very big urban roof. Other kind they called Festival Plaza, and height is about interior 30 meter and 300 meter long, and there are a strange monument in the middle, and Peter Cook and Archigram and many other people. Dennis was there, for all the exhibitions was inside the roof. It was done. And it lasts only 6 months, and many performances are done here, and also same time test of different type of the mechanical for the performance, like using completely computer system, moving sound and moving light, and all kind of things are happening. And later on, and I have the other group from Italy. They are working more about non-stop city or idea or so on, and Brandy, and so on. And this is another way I did some similar concept for future city with. And go back to 68. This is this 68 Triennale in Milano when it was open, and exact the same time it was occupied by students. And this is one of the steps in the Triennale building. And they had a meeting protesting, and so on, so on. And at that time, I was the first. This was my first project outside Japan. I was there in Milano and working on this kind of panel, quite young. And that time, so the two guys here. Exactly same time, and this is my photos at the time of the Triennale. And Albert Van Eyck, he was there also. And so my idea was, of course, archigram idea is shown in the design museum at the moment, you can see. And my idea was this kind of, again, the moving, rotating panels. And this, all those materials completely destroyed. But last year, or 2 years ago, some museum, Karlsruhe, Torino, portal. They worked to reconstruct my part. This was the product produced recently. And that time, I selected many images with ghosts and atomic bombs, dead bodies, and some many photographs and so on, and projections. And this is my montage, collage. It's at a very big screen on the walls, and all the future utopian projects at that time are projected on this. And I try to say once more, future city is ruined. This is the photo is on the actual atomic bomb situation at Hiroshima, and broken structure I picked up from some part of the Hiroshima and collage, and showing some mega structure. And so I call this Once More Ruined Hiroshima. This is my title. Thank you.
What do I do? What makes it come on? What do I do to make this one come on?
Which is yours?
Yes, mine is the one that just says Japan.
Yeah.
So. While it's warming up, I'll just say that, of course, inevitably memories come flooding back, and I get a real sense this afternoon. Not only do I remember the famous event when the slide carousel collapsed, and I think Alvin and I anyhow were hosts of that particular event, and if you're the host of your friend and your visitor, you sort of wince with them and you think, my God, will they ever come back again? And it's sort of thing that happens rather more frequently than we would like to admit. Yes, when we go to Japan, of course, it was with all this background, as Arata has said, and in fact it was Arata who not only brought me to Japan, but many, many other people, not only the people like Hans Hollein and so on that he has mentioned, Jim Sterling, but people of many generations. And I think I want to make that very clear, that he has been a wonderful sort of, dare I suggest it, entrepreneur and link man between Japan and the outside world. What he may only realize slightly is what a tremendous effect it's had on us. That I think there are two places for my consciousness that really, when I got there, I felt as if I should have been there all the time. One is Tokyo and Kyoto, and the other is Los Angeles. I won't bang on about Los Angeles today, but because the thing that it also, you take yourself with you, and you encounter the other person with you, so that it was great for Izzo and I to spend probably sort of 3 or 4 days out of every week together going around in the rain. It's a wet winter, seeing all the stuff that was in Gebhard's book, virtually everything in there. And you get to know somebody through your joint agreements or disagreements or wry comments or jokes that you make about a third party's architecture. That's interesting. Because the other thing that happened to me personally was that when I got to Japan, it coincided, I suppose, with the sort of beginning another stream of one's own interest, not only in sort of archigrammic or post-archigrammic work, but the sort of veggie end, the soft end. And one of the things I found myself dwelling upon and contriving on subsequent visits to Japan to go to was to look, strangely enough, not just at the tiki-taki and the kikutaki tiki-taki, but the limpid, what I call the limpid pool syndrome. The thing that one, I can't even remember which particular palace garden this is, but I'm sure there are 100 people in the room who do know. But the limpid pool syndrome and that existence of the very special object that is there in the same kind of theatricality, dare one suggest, that one gets at places like Stourhead. And in fact, in earlier lectures, I very often have drawn analogies between Rasham or Stourhead and some of the Japanese gardens on small or larger scale. That one sensed immediately when you got to Japan that there was more than met the eye. Not only did we live in damp islands moored off the coast of the major continent, from which we, of course, derive the origins of our culture, but our perverse small damp islands driving on the left, where the thing that we really enjoy to do is to pervert that culture. I think that Japanese culture is much more, seems to me, infinitely more idiosyncratic and curious and bitchy and wispy and witty and naughty, in the same way that, you could say the English characteristic distinguishes itself from the French or German main European thrusts, that we take those philosophies or those architectural ideas from the mainland, and we get very quickly bored with them and start doing something silly. And the other analogies I draw is in having had many Japanese students who've become friends, and friends have become friends, and so on, that they also enjoy a giggle in the same way that we do here. That the thing that the Japanese really, we both come from these very old, established cultures, From the outside, we're very steady and very long culture, and it's sort of polite. If you notice, we're not polite at all, neither the English or the Japanese. We love toys, we love silly things, we love pissing about, we love gossip, we love making fun. And so you go to Tokyo, and it was as if it was waiting there, that archigram should have come out of Tokyo. There's more than meets the eye to this. You take yourself with you, but you also take your own particular take on culture with you. And what is culture if not to be taken with you? Now, this is, I forget which magazine, probably SD, at the long-lamented SD magazine. It was the gang of Tokyo, of the generation a bit after Izzo's generation, maybe, or I don't think he's in the picture, but one of the wonderful things that he did, and something which I think is very, very unusual, on my first visit to Tokyo in, I think, 78 or thereabouts, he gave a party in what was then his rather smaller apartment, kind of normal.
Yeah, very small.
Yeah, small apartment, and there he was, and he said, I've invited a few people round who you ought to get to know, and they were all architects younger than him, but not a lot younger. And that's very interesting, because it's been my subsequent experience going around the world that you can have a grand architect or an up-and-coming architect or whoever is your host, and they may introduce you to people who are much older and famous, or people who are much younger and therefore no threat to themselves. But what he did was interesting, was he knew that these guys had talent, and in one fell swoop, and he did the same thing a year and a half later when Christine Hawley and I visited, and he again invited the same crew, and it was no less than Ito, Hasegawa, Sakamoto, I think. I can't remember the whole gang, but half of the people on that picture there. The other thing, of course, is one's view that an architectural culture, unless you're a very special kind of person who can sit on the top of a mountain or in a sort of outback university somewhere or by a limpid pool, but for most of us, we are as good as those with whom we are consciously competing. It's not that you meet those people every day, but you might meet them down the corridor if you're lucky, you might meet them down the end of the street, but in certain communities, and I think this explains, the fin de siècle, Vienna, it explains Tokyo at certain periods of the last century, hopefully now. It explains Los Angeles at a particular moment in the last century. It may explain certain syndromes in New York in recent times, etc. And London, you know, let's admit that it's that mixture of kind of camaraderie, envy, competitiveness, but being aware of a certain circuit of people who you very well might meet in the corridor or down the end of the street. Certain cities have a buzz, and certainly Tokyo had that buzz, and so it was a double thing. It was not only the physicality of the culture, but it was the buzz of those people who have subsequently gone on to be one's friends of a close generation. And Izzo did that, and he has repeatedly done that with I think, tremendous modesty and generosity. And one hopes that one has done the same in reverse. This was my official reason, or the reason he contrived for me to be there and got lots of Japan Foundation money and all sorts of nice things, was to go and judge the Shinkenshuku competition. So you've gone all this way to this place that you've always dreamed of going to, and you're in a darkened room, rather like this, for about 5 days, looking at 500 drawings. It's sort of, for those of us who teach in architecture, business as usual, except it's supposed to be somewhere else outside. And so you go to it, and in the end, I think slightly it could even have been to his irritation, rather than giving me the first prize to one of the many non-Japanese, I gave it to some mysterious Japanese guys called Takasu and Takasaki. And their project, it's a very dirty old slide, revamped, and so it's given it added historical flavour. It's in fact not quite as gritty as that, but it was called Confusion. And these two guys were confused, presumably, but I thought that their project was absolutely stunningly beautiful and mysterious, and had sort of Duchampian overtones and sort of Japanese overtones, whatever they were. The same guy built, Takasaki, Masaharu Takasaki, built this object. Unfortunately, when on not probably the next visit, but the next, some visits down the road, I visited Takasaki to discover that his wife had died and his building had been taken down. All right, a lot you can say when a guy tells you that. He recovered, and some years later I was able to invite him to Frankfurt to show his stuff, and these are some students in his office. And in fact, I think that it was, you know, and here is Takasaki in his crazy office. Now, of course, this is not the only crazy office in Japan. What, in fact, one has discovered is that the majority of offices in Japan are very tight for space. And somehow that's part, I mean, in a way that seems to me, as an old sort of slobberer around, part of the creativity. That if I have noticed that I have visited sometimes around the world some extremely large and elegant and well-disposed offices, and there might be a bit of energy going on in the corner then, a bit of energy, but the rest is sort of bullshit, or you know, aren't we getting famous? We've got such a big office syndrome. Whereas this is it's coming down, breathing onto your head, and there's another piquant occasion. There is the young Christine Hawley and the young Arata Izazaki looking at a pile of books. I'm not quite sure why they're looking at a pile of books, and they're sort of out of the corner. I'm taking the photograph and looking at what is, by the standards of the day, an extremely luxurious Japanese office, namely Izzo's, when he got a couple of large jobs on the go, I suspect. But still, actually, by our standards today, pretty pokey and pretty... I mean, it's amusing that we were sitting yesterday in the recreated Archigram office in the exhibition, and remembering what offices were like. Another thing is the friendliness of many Japanese architects. Toyo Ito welcoming myself with about, off the picture, about 35 students who've come in from Europe. And he's not in his nightshirt, actually, that is the fashion item. But he's welcoming us for breakfast. And so then suddenly something like the Silver Hut becomes not one of those things you see in a glossy magazine. It's actually a place with a bloke in it who has a bathroom that you use and some biscuits. You know, it's suddenly the whole thing changes its mannerism. And I have to thank Arata again
for this connection. This is my wife in the foreground, and a certain Mr. Takamatsu. One, of course, the other excuses for the interchange with Japan is particularly at this particular restaurant, the absolutely stunning diet that you come back from Japan vowing never to go near a pudding again. It lasts about 3 days, but vowing never to go near spaghetti bolognese or steak and kidney or fish and chips again. Now, what is intriguing, and why I put this slide in, is because there is that same Shin Takamatsu with his moustache and this extremely elegant version of a traditional Japanese meal. There is tradition. We are in a traditional room. We are eating on traditional plates and so on, and we are going through the very, very traditional situation. And yet the same guy does things like that. And to what extent is there a Japaneseness about this? To what extent is the placement of those little dentals and those little recreated Otto Wagner little points there, to what extent is that also the same tradition that suggests that a plate and the way in which a piece of fish is placed upon a certain moment in the plate and the way in which the, etc., that happens on the table, is a certain sensibility. And I think Arata touched upon a very important aspect, which is this condition of light and the filtration of light. And that is something which one was ready for, I think, in a project that we took and exhibited at that second or third visit. Christine and I had done a project where we were interested in layers and meshes, but when one looked at it vis-a-vis Japan, one realized we were being extremely primitive and ploddy and plonky by comparison. Interestingly, the last group of, I think a Bartlett group went to Japan about 2 months ago and came back with tremendous interest and enthusiasm for Shin Takamatsu. And I thought nobody was talking about him anymore. So that's interesting. Are there these cycles of interest in a certain sort of overcooked architecture, if I may use such a term? Of course, if one goes to Japan, you meet people. One of our sort of favorite friends, I suppose, just as it's turned out, is Itsuka Hasegawa. And this, I believe, is where she lives, or certainly where she has lived. But we've never been asked in. That's intriguing, and that is, if I may say so, a particular character, apart from Arata, one of the few people to whom one has ever been in the kitchen and the toilets and sort of, I don't know about the bedroom, but certainly, into somebody's house, and that is very intriguing. And one of the things that still intrigues is that in a still, although Arata has been one of the first people to advance the cause of women architects, not only in the group of houses that Christine and others took part in Gifu, but also it is to be remembered that he was, I think, the key judge in the peak competition, which was Zaha's big breakthrough. Though it was not built, it certainly had her international breakthrough, and was, I think, the key judge in this competition, which Itsuka Hasegawa won for probably the most weird building I've ever seen. Except when you look at the ground plan, it all works terribly well. You go in there and there's no, unlike some rather more rationalist buildings I've been to, you can find the Genslu incredibly quickly. And were you going to get a library book or to make a radio recording, you can also do that extremely efficiently. The plan is very, very sensible. The object is, I suppose by today's standards, very unfashionable and certainly over the top. Except that what's interesting about Shonendai is that there wasn't any top to be over. It was probably, worse than Slough before it had this thing. And if one thinks of so that I think the concept of the landmark building that puts the place on the map has to be traced back, certainly including Shonendai and its metal trees. And in a way, even this is Hasegawa in her cooler moments. But what about Izo? I mean, he's done lots of stuff, some of which I don't like, a lot of which I do like, and I have favourites. And one of my real still favourites, I think this has got the same gremlin. I think this one is not upside down, but probably back to front. It's the PowerPoint syndrome. It seems to get all of us. The old slide, you knew where you were, white on one side and black on the other side, and stick it in the right way, and it still fell out the tray anyhow. But this is the golf club, which I think you took us down to Oita, your home territory. We went out to see this wonderful building. It is in the form of a question mark, but actually I think it's still one of the best buildings that I've ever been in that deals with landscape, in the sense that you set up this extraordinary horizontal condition. You make it a space, but you make this horizontal condition, which I think is only rivaled by something like Leverance's Church, where you look at the window and it's on the ground line of the field outside. It's that sort of game, and I think it's still one of your best things. You don't talk about it much these days, but it's due for the kind of revival which will probably mean that somebody will copy it. And I think this is another one where you've brought yourself to an odd corner of Europe, up in fish-eating La Coruña, and I haven't seen it in the flesh, but it's again one that I have a great affection for. I think it's Iso on that same kind of very simple and telling form. Lights. When I took my 4-year-old son to Japan, he said, vertical lights, vertical lights. He still remembers these vertical lights many years later as the most I think it was the first evening we got into town, and there was all these vertical lights. It's absolutely fantastic, and I think that's something which, yes, of course, everywhere has got lights now, and if you go, it's somehow, yes, but the Japanese, because they know about the filtration of natural, I don't know what they, give me another hour, I'll bullshit my way through this issue, but it's something to do with knowing about the filtration of light. Somehow then it gives them something to base their electrics on. I can't quite put my finger on it. Hasegawa again playing with drapes of light. And so little wonder that I myself, given half the chance, do something that subconsciously pays homage to Japan. Now this is a naughty one put in specially for Urata's benefit, because he was there when I took the photo, and he was very upset because I think he thought it was me sending up the Japanese culture. I'm sure the building, I'm sure it's been taken down, but I forget whether we were in a vehicle or walking along. You said, no, we must have been in a car, and I said, can I just stop and take this? You said, you're very grumpy about it. Why are you taking that? And I used to pass it by from where we were staying every morning. It's horrendous and wonderful. It's one of those buildings which I always think and it's remained with me. And I haven't used it in a lecture for quite a long time, but it remains with me. It's very, very good, very bad. or it's certainly not bad good. It can only be. But if you were trying to explain to your grandmother what 20th century architecture was about, you said it's about glass, and it's about horizontality, and it's about expressing the corner. And you could go through a whole long list of things which this building does, except we're all laughing at it. And why are we laughing at it? Huh? And I guess one can now find many more examples elsewhere, but it's something the Japanese do very, very well. It's very, very brilliant awful. Such as we just do boring awful, or boring architecture trying to be good, which is much more tedious. And of course there's certain people that I don't suppose many of you in the room approve of this architect very much, and I'm not at all sure what he's doing right now, but Kitagawa was a sort of... I was told on the grapevine before I met him that Kitagawa at this time was looking at what was going on in the AA. And I heard that from more than one source. I think it was Peter Wilson who particularly kept repeating this piece of information. And I assure you that wasn't quite what was going on in the AA. But there's something about it. It's the talented trying to be awful in order to be good, or is it awful anyway, or is it actually really rather good, except you have to have a stomach for it? I think buildings like this, and that for me has always been the titillation, not only at the level of the extraordinary discrimination of the gardens in Kyoto, not only the extraordinary discrimination and ability with the filtration of light and the creation of space, etc., 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 but also the awful, also the silly. It's that moment at which the silly is brought into the game by the actually quite intelligent, dare I suggest. And therefore, I find the architecture in between, which I'm sure in the corridors of the A is much more discussed, and Shigeru Ban, I think, is a lovely bloke. He's a very nice bloke, but I can't get quite as interested in this, though I'm sure some of the values that I just mentioned are represented by it. But it's a personal thing. You know, as you go around, you use places and experiences and people and buildings for your own purposes. And you might admit that they're good in their own kind, but if they are not useful to you, you put them in a different back pocket. And the same, in a way, with Mr. Jima, who is a much admired international architect, probably the most admired of the Japanese international architects. She is highly exportable, which, of course, if I want to be naughty, I would say, does that mean that she's less Japanese? Or does it mean that now Japanese architecture really has reached that interchangeability? Has it really reached that position in the international discussion or in the international processing of architecture, whereby you no longer have to say so-and-so is Japanese, but they're also good. No. No longer do you have to say that they're Japanese, therefore they're interesting. You simply say, this is a very world architect. Oh, by the way, yes, she's Japanese, I think. Yes, kind of thing. Which is a staging in the process. And finally, back to Kyoto. I don't know whether it's the famous building or sideways, but it recalls a sort of serenity, which I have rather used less pictures. In other lectures in the past, I've used far more pictures of silly things, and buildings going on their side, and electrics, and so on and so on. I didn't feel that was appropriate for this evening. What I feel is that you take yourself with you, and one hopes that, I think Murata has been very, very generous in suggesting that so much was offered by this side. I think we were sucking more out of you than you've ever got out of the English scene. But it's lovely to have you back again. And the other speakers who I think also between all of you have set such an air of authenticity that I don't know whether I'm thanking them on your behalf or London's behalf or Bloomsbury's behalf, but I think it's smashing to have this stuff here this afternoon, really.